Wonderful. It's 1 o'clock. Welcome to our webinar, How to Train Managers to Support Your Employee Through Pregnancy Loss in the Workplace. We're delighted to have you here today, whether you're taking a small break, multitasking, and listening to us in the background. We hope you'll find the next 45 minutes to an hour informative. So whilst you get settled, I will go through a few housekeeping points, if you'll allow me. As you may have heard when you joined, the webinar is being recorded, meaning we will circulate a copy upon ending. If you can join or you have to leave for any reason, that will be also easy to share with any of your colleagues. I want to remind you that you can use the chat function if you want to chat to us, or the Q&A function. If you do want to use the Q&A function and you would like to remain anonymous or not share any identifiable information, please remember to take the anonymous box. And we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. We'd love this to be as collaborative as possible. Please share questions, your stories. Usually our webinars are very interactive, which makes them so great. And finally, of course, we will be discussing very sensitive things pertaining to pregnancy loss today. So if at any point you feel it's too much or you need to leave, again, please feel free to do so. We understand that it can be a difficult conversation. Again, though, the webinar will be circulated, so you can always catch up later. Perfect. It's 101. We have had the attendee number double during that small housekeeping section. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Celine Crawford, your Fertifa co-host for today. As the Director of People at Fertifa, I'm passionate about building high-performing teams and inclusive cultures, and that starts with the right support for employees. Like many of us at Fertifa, I have a personal story with reproductive health and specifically with pregnancy loss. Having been a chief people officer as well, you can say I've experienced both sides of the reproductive health coin. And I think all of us on the panel today are very experienced from a personal and also workplace perspective. So we're really looking forward to having a chat with you. Before I introduce Holly and allow Claire to introduce herself and Fertility Matters at Work, if you're new to Fertifa, we're Europe's most comprehensive reproductive health and neurodiversity benefits provider, meaning we help employers like Meta, Sony, Lululemon support their employees through the entire reproductive health journey. That can be fertility, family forming, menopause, men's health. Again, it's about creating inclusive workplaces, which is exactly what today's webinar is about. So before I introduce our esteemed guest, I will go to my colleague, Holly. Are you okay to give a quick introduction on yourself, Holly, please?
Yeah, so hi everyone. Just to echo Celine's words, I also just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Holly, I'm Head of Clinical Services at Fertifa, and I'm here to bring a clinical perspective to today's conversation about training managers supporting employees experiencing pregnancy loss. My professional background spans midwifery and fertility nursing, so I've had many years of supporting a variety of people through a wide range of pregnancy losses, whether that's challenges of fertility treatment, a miscarriage, to stillbirth and medically advised termination as well. But it's not just professional for me either. Like Celine said, I've also faced pregnancy loss myself, and that drives my passion to create workplaces that provide real meaningful support through policy and everyday practice. And it's such a vital and sensitive topic, and I'm really looking forward to sharing practical insights and answering your questions, and helping you feel equipped to support your teams through these experiences as well.
Thank you, Holly. So now, Claire, over to you. We're delighted to partner with you and Fertility Matters at Work. You're one of the co-founders and head of people at Fertility Matters at Work. Can you tell us a bit more about the purpose of Fertility Matters at Work and the work you do there?
So, hi everybody, it's really great to be here. My name's Claire Ingle. I'm one of the co-founders, like Celine's just said, of Fertility Matters at Work. We do what it says on the tin. The three of us that are co-founders all had our own lived experience of fertility treatment whilst working, and it wasn't a very good one. So we kind of got our heads together and decided to change things for the people that were coming behind us. And we formed just before the pandemic, which is really bad timing if we'd have known what we knew now. And we just educate workplaces on how important it is to be supportive with these conversations, and we do include pregnancy loss in that. And from a personal perspective, also have experienced pregnancy loss, and I've got about nearly 30 years as an experienced HR professional, so I come at it from, again, the two different hats as well. So happy to answer any questions and support anybody during this webinar. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Claire. So during this webinar, as we touched on, we'll be offering some advice on HR teams on how to train managers, on support their employees. We'll go through kind of practical advice, the legal framework that we have currently, and really how to open up workplace conversations. We know that nearly 70% of people say that their manager has more of an impact on their mental well-being than a therapist or doctor, which is really, really high. So hopefully you'll agree that it is a very important subject. But before we begin, let's start with some definitions. And I'm going to go over to you, Holly, really starting at the beginning. What do we mean by the term pregnancy loss?
So for the purposes of this webinar, I think when we talk about pregnancy loss, we're specifically referring to loss that happens before 24 weeks of pregnancy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we come to sort of like the legalities around sort of pre and post 24 weeks a bit later on. We've chosen to use the term pregnancy loss rather than just something like miscarriage, because miscarriage, while it's the most commonly recognized form of loss, it doesn't fully encompass the range of experiences that people go through. Miscarriage typically refers to the spontaneous loss of a pregnancy, but there are other situations such as ectopic pregnancy, molar pregnancy, termination for medical reason, unsuccessful embryo transfer after IVF, that all also result in pregnancy ending before 24 weeks. And I think it's really important that we consider these experiences to be just as physically and emotionally difficult, no matter where they happen within that pregnancy. And that's something that I see time and time again in my clinical practice. And it's just really important that our language reflects that reality as well. It's also important to recognise that when we're talking about pregnancy loss, it can mean different things to different people, and it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all situation. And we're also not talking about it just from a medical clinical perspective, as pregnancy loss isn't just a medical event. It's very, very much an emotional experience too. And the way someone can process that will depend on lots of different factors, whether that's personal circumstances, cultural beliefs, the support available to them, whether that's their own network or whether that's their workplace. And it's also important that we're not just talking about pregnancy loss as it happens to the individual. There's a mixture of people that are involved in that, whether it's a partner, whether it's intended parents, and it's often something that we find is overlooked, and we want to make sure that that is no longer the case. So if we're mentioning that today, we are talking about everybody that's involved in that, not just the individual.
Thanks for that. I think, Claire, you were very passionate about that specific point. So did you want to elaborate on that a little bit in terms of the modern families today?
Yeah, so we often, what really frustrates me about this topic is it's often labelled as a women's health issue. And, I in my work, I work with a lot of same-sex couples who experience pregnancy loss as well, either via a surrogate or their own pregnancy loss of a female same-sex relationship. And it's really important that we describe everything we talk about in terms of this umbrella is around people and not women and men. And we don't give people, we don't gender it. We should have it absolutely, it's about everybody, because it's 1 in 4 people that experience loss. And when we put that female element at it, that's where all the focus goes. And actually there are people who are partners, if partners are involved, that are part of that emotional journey as well, and they often get forgotten. There's a lot of studies around that, so I know we'll talk about that a little bit later, but yeah, people's the best way to go with this.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, we say 1 in 4, but, that doesn't even take into account losses that are not reported. So the number
Correct.
is much, much higher. But absolutely, you're right. And we will be discussing this when we discuss how to put together a very comprehensive and inclusive policy around that. But thinking back to, I guess, grief, which is one of the consequences of pregnancy loss, it doesn't follow office hours, and employees, people, again, will need the time and space to heal, because as we said, it might be physical or emotional symptoms. I mean, most of the time, both that happen. I guess from your experience in HR, Claire, what are some of the emotional impacts that you have seen, or to people you've spoken to, that come up when going through such losses?
Okay, so there's a massive, we could do an entire webinar on this point alone, but the people that we speak to regularly, especially if they're not supported by their workplace, they feel disengaged, they lose all kind of trust and confidence in their employer. We speak to a lot of people who leave their job because I've had one recently, a lady that's had repeated losses, and because of how her employers dealt with her, she's resigned. And that's not uncommon, but because we don't talk about it and because it's not in the public eye, and it's a very kind of sensitive topic, it gets hidden. So you said at the beginning, didn't you, that 1 in 4, we know that pregnancy loss is really underrepresented, and the real number is probably a lot less, like 1 in 3, maybe 1 in 2. But people's experience in work is what makes it work for that person. So we often, with our research, we look at line manager as well. So line manager interaction is very, very important. So if you've got a really supportive, great line manager, that can really make your experience very different, even if the company at an arm's length isn't really great. But it's also works on the opposite as well if somebody isn't supportive. And we find that's for a load of reasons. It could be that they just don't validate it, it's not important, it's not talked about, so people just think it's a medical thing, and then you just get on with it and you carry on, and there's no emotional attachment to it. I think there's little research about the emotional impact that this sort of conversation has, so we need more of that data to then inform businesses.
Absolutely. And at the end of the day, as a business, you want to have happy employees because they'll be most
Of
productive.
course.
So everyone ends up, being better off, let's say. And
Yeah.
to complete the emotional aspect, Holly, can you talk a bit about the physical impact of pregnancy loss, and obviously drawing on my own experience of the pregnancy losses I had? No two were the same, right? So that's very important as well to say that it's not a one size fits all. It's very important to treat everything kind of on a case by case. But if we were to introduce the types of physical consequences, can you share from your experience what patients come to you for?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, for most, I think before you kind of like start digging into sort of what pregnancy loss is and what that means, I think a lot of us might have just expected a pregnancy loss to be like a single event and it's sort of done and over, and actually in reality it's much more intense than that. There's much more medical follow-up involved in that as well. Even something that is clinically straightforward, I have, not including like the emotional side of that, but there might be follow-up scans, there might be follow-up appointments. For some cases, it might be that follow-up care is needed for up to sort of 6 months or so, even after a loss has taken place, when we're sort of thinking about things like molar pregnancy, for example. I think there can be lots of we've talked a little bit about the emotional side, but lots of triggers as well. So even milestones like due dates and sort of like other pregnancy announcements within a workplace can be quite difficult for people to manage. But yeah, as Celine said, it's very much different for every person. Someone might experience some symptoms for a very short while afterwards. It can be ongoing for a very long time. And it's just important that what worked for one employee or one person or someone that is definitely not going to be the same as what the next person requires in terms of that support. But yeah, it can be very, very different depending on the situation, even if it is a very clinically straightforward.
Absolutely. And then the final point, and it's one of the things I've learned, one of the first things I've learned at Fertifa, actually from our medical director, is even if you've gone through a loss, that doesn't mean that the person that you're helping or supporting is going to have the same experience as you. And again, not to kind of transpose your own experience on them. I see, Claire, you're agreeing with me. So is that something that you've seen as well?
Yeah, I work with this great trainer, and she says walk a mile in someone else's shoes, but keep your own socks on. So I really like that phrase. She
Love
uses it quite
that.
regularly. And yeah, I'd never heard about it until I worked with her. So it's okay to kind of understand and empathize and do all those things that you would do as a compassionate employer or friend or colleague or whatever. But it's also really important to not, like you've just said, project your own experience. I mean, we see it happening with fertility and pregnancy loss, that people say, well, I did this, or I know someone who did this, and that's actually not entirely helpful. That's probably one of the practical things for the end of the webinar, but it's not helpful to start fixing things. But we're human, and we have this innate desire to just fix something for somebody, and I think it's just knowing just to hold back and just be a pair of ears to listen rather than just solve stuff.
Absolutely. And so I guess what we're trying to say is any type of manager, whether they have had experience or they've had no experience, can learn and can make sure that they are, dealing with the person in the right way. So that's really, really great. Um, a little bit on, I guess, the HR or legal frameworks that are available at the moment. Obviously, not so long ago, the government created a certificate to acknowledge loss, which people can have. Which is good to signpost in a policy as well. But Claire, from your experience, what is currently the entitlement for employees who are going through a miscarriage or a pregnancy loss?
Okay, that's easy because there isn't any.
I know.
There's no statutory support. However, like we've seen with the menopause conversation, I think this being in the public eye, as well as fertility, there's a lot more traction around this. And I know we're campaigning Parliament at Fertility Matters at Work for statutory paid time off. And there are a lot of organisations, I've got to say, I read a lot of policies for a lot of organisations in the work that I do. And there's a lot of people deciding to give employees paid time off, which is great because it's being proactive and it's not waiting for the legislation to come in. It's signalling we're a supportive employer. We will help you, even though the law isn't telling us we have to. I think NHS England, was it last year, mandated 5 days paid leave for everybody. I think it was 5 or 10. I can't remember off the top of my head, paid leave for people who experience pregnancy loss in the NHS, which is a really big thing because the NHS is England's biggest employer, about 1.2 million people. And I know there are other organisations that do it as well. But if that question is, there is no entitlement, but that doesn't mean you can't be proactive and forward thinking and innovative with your organisation and say, we recognise this is an issue. We want to validate people's experience and we want to be an employer of choice by supporting people through this.
Absolutely, that's really, really important. And obviously we're talking about miscarriage here, but Holly, there's also the case of neonatal loss that will be completely separate again after 24 weeks. And I think teams should just be aware as to what the ramifications are for, both. But what I have seen as well is, again, very supportive companies that have that flexibility to help employees through their case by case. For example, you may have someone who's had a loss at 23 weeks and then will feel quite, I guess, I don't know if frustrated is the right word, but that it's unfair that they wouldn't get the same terms as someone at 24 weeks. So what's your view, Claire, on, I guess, that flexibility?
Oh gosh, it's hard, isn't it? Because the law puts a kind of marker at the 24th week. And then obviously after the 24th week, you're entitled to maternity leave, the statutory legislation. I mean, I guess for me, it's a really difficult place to be, isn't it? Because I think that the best place to be would that everybody got something, and it was all equal. But obviously, I think we've got a long way to go in employment law, especially in the UK, around that one. And again, it's around, you mentioned about flexibility. I think you can't give somebody who loses at 23 weeks maternity leave because the statutory entitlement won't allow you. But that doesn't mean, again, as an organisation, you can't go, actually, this is really significant. It's going to really take its toll on this individual medically and emotionally and psychologically. What can we do to support? Okay. And I think people think that if they open floodgates and they start saying you're entitled to this amount of stuff, they're going to have all these people asking for it. And what our research has shown is that people don't do that. They use it when they need it. And because it's there and it can be used, people feel a lot safer in the workplace and they just feel happier working for that employer.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Before we move on, I did see a question that I missed earlier on the definitions around molar pregnancy. So Holly, I will go to you. And I actually did have a molar pregnancy and also did not know what it was until obviously I was in that situation. But could you elaborate a little more on what the molar pregnancy is, Holly, clinically?
Yeah, so a molar pregnancy is when an egg and a sperm fertilize and the embryo would then implant within the uterus as a normal pregnancy. But in the case of molar pregnancy, there is too much genetic material, and it basically means that the cells multiply too quickly. And unfortunately, it does mean that in those cases, the pregnancy is not one that will continue and does need surgery to remove that pregnancy. In a very, very worst case scenario, in that situation, it can lead to sort of even something like cancer, where the cells continue to develop. And this is one in particular where the ongoing care is really quite lengthy in some cases, where, you know, in some cases, even things like chemotherapy might be needed. It's very, very rare. Again, hence why we have patients that have that experience and don't know enough about it. But again, just sort of being aware that that is something that can happen makes all the difference to that employee that presents at the desk one day.
Yeah. I mean, I recall for me, especially, you know, it is just a continuous having to monitor, you know, your blood levels and seeing how things are developing, not really having a firm answer until a specific time. So that takes an emotional toll. And so hopefully when we discuss the policy section, or as Claire also alluded to, you know, how managers can support, we can go back as to what people can do on that front. So there is another question actually here. Is pregnancy in unknown location classed as a loss? I've not actually heard that term before. So Holly.
So pregnancy of unknown location is where either through blood tests or pregnancy testing, we've been able to identify the pregnancy hormone within the body. Which means that there is a pregnancy somewhere, but it just might not be identifiable on scan. In most cases, it turns out that that tends to be an ectopic pregnancy, where the pregnancy is started to develop within the tube or the ovary. But again, I think it would quite safely sit within the sort of remit of pregnancy loss, because someone is pregnant, they might have been trying to get pregnant, it might be that they've had fertility treatment even for that, and they will need ongoing care and support to identify where that pregnancy is, whether that's going to be a concern, whether they might need surgery or further intervention to kind of minimize any risks that might present as a result of that. So yes, I would say that it does consider pregnancy loss.
Thank you so much. Claire, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I did want to add something. There's a really amazing quote that we use in our webinars, and it's by a fertility counsellor called Jerry McCluskey. I can't quote it word for word, but she talks about loss being within this kind of space, a hidden loss and a disenfranchised loss, as opposed to loss of a loved one of whom you might have photographs or memories and things like that. But just because it's hidden, and it you know, it isn't what other people might see as a loss, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and it doesn't mean it doesn't impact people either.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's also not only in terms of where it's happening physically, but for people not wanting to share or like suffering in silence, which is why we call
Yes.
them silent tragedies sometimes. And you reminded me of a quote that really stuck with me is, how do you say goodbye to someone you've never met? You know, whereas exactly as you were saying, when it's loss of a loved one, there will be more evidence as to
Yeah.
that person being. So yeah, thank you for clarifying. Before we move on how to open the workplace conversations, we did have one more question, Claire, about what you were saying, that the government in the UK had mandated those 5 days. The question is, when was this? And was it just for the women who were carrying, or I guess the implication is partner? Where can more information be found?
So it wasn't UK, it was the NHS who put it into their guidance. It was NHS England. I think it was Birmingham. I'm going to pull on my memory now. Birmingham Women's Hospital trialed it, and then they rolled it out about a year. It was about a year ago. There was a big piece of news about it across like the BBC and everything, and in the NHS, if there's anybody that works in the NHS on the call. And it should be in policy that you have that time. I don't think it says specifically if it's for you or partners, but I work in HR, and I would extend that to partners too. So if somebody came to me and said, I've not experienced a loss, but my partner is, there wouldn't be any question. I'd be like, yep, that's fine. It's, you know, that's the right thing to do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Okay, so
I think
let's.
someone's put
Oh,
that
yes.
its first trials at Birmingham.
Yes, sorry, I just missed that. Introduction of paid leave for NHS staff following a miscarriage was first tried at Birmingham Women's and Children's
Yeah.
NHS Trust,
Yeah.
where a staff survey found that staff were twice as likely to stay with their employer as a result of the
So
policy. Thank you so much for that. Much appreciated. Wonderful. I'm just conscious of time because there's just so much to talk about. And I do want to make sure we're touching on the topic of today. So let's go to workplace conversations. I think all of us here are very passionate about inclusion, and we talk about leading with empathy and opening up those workplace conversations. So I'm going to go to you, Claire. If you're thinking about workplaces, what have you kind of advised people, or what are some of the tips about being able to not only open the conversation, but keep the conversation going?
Okay, so one of the reasons is that we don't have a lot of understanding around this is because people don't talk about it, but people don't talk about it because in society we don't talk about it. So it's very important in a business that you have a psychologically safe environment where people can be honest and transparent, because a lot of people do hide loss. They hide fertility journeys, they hide loss. Under that umbrella, a lot of things get hidden and kind of pushed aside and not talked about in the workplace. So we encourage organisations to signal that they will be supportive. And that's a cultural piece. That isn't a tick box exercise where you get a policy and you say, we will support with this. This is living and breathing this every day, that when people speak up or when they come to you with an issue, it's dealt with empathy and compassion, and with the person at the forefront of those decisions, and not a business or bottom line or things like that. So that's very, very important. And as we know, you can't just change culture overnight. It's not something you can just go, right, we're going to talk about this now, and then everyone else goes, oh, that's it, I feel safe. It doesn't work like that. It can be quite a lengthy journey. So it's really important to recognize that. You might have had conversations in organizations about menopause already. I know I could keep talking about that, but this conversation is following the menopause trajectory, in that we didn't talk about it 5-6 years ago, and it's everywhere now. It's a like real kind of solid workplace conversation, and this is what needs to happen with this.
Absolutely, you're so right. Love everything that you're saying. So about one of the ways that people usually start when they're not sure where to start is to offer a pregnancy loss policy, or at least start putting together a pregnancy loss policy. Holly, I know that you worked with us very closely at Fertifa, and also to shape those kinds of policies for our clients from a medical perspective. What are some of the things that are important when putting together such a policy? And then I'll go to you, Claire.
I think, as you sort of touched on already, Celine, I think the flexibility is important, and not just considering the individual that might be happening to and extending that to others that are involved, whether that's partner or intended parents. Again, I think I'm sorry to repeat myself, but I think milestones are particularly important. So the flexibility means that if someone is coming up to a due date, or they were due to have a scan on a particular day, being able to take some time off or be able to work from home on that day, for example, can make the world of difference to that person. The same with partners being included in that. If you have I'm going to say woman for this purpose, but it could be anybody, a woman that's going through a miscarriage that needs a follow-up scan, to go on her own because her partner isn't able to attend with her because they don't have the backup support is detrimental to someone's sort of well-being in that scenario. So it's just sort of thinking outside the box a little bit about how that flexible policy might work, and how it allows for that support as well. It's also worth considering having a sort of like a return to work discussion with that as well. It might be that, for example, someone gives that person a heads up that there might be a baby shower happening at work, or there's a pregnancy announcement, a birth announcement even, and how they want that to be managed. It might be that they want to be included. It might be that they absolutely don't want to be. I think there's very much an assumption that when someone has been through a pregnancy loss and that is understood, and others are aware of that we don't talk to them about that anymore. It's they don't want to hear about this, but that's not always the case. I've come across individuals in my practice where they felt very much excluded from sort of friendship circles and things like that, because they've no longer being invited to these things, and that's not what they want. So never make assumptions, I would say, is probably quite a good thing. But yeah, I think definitely the flexibility is like the most important thing, I think.
Thank you so much. So when I think about the policies and what you've said, I always think about the trifecta of the person going through it, the manager, and the HR team as well, and how they can work together to support the employees. So from an HR perspective, or just from a workplace perspective, Claire, what other things in your mind are important to think about when thinking of putting together an inclusive pregnancy loss policy?
So go back to my first point around include everybody. So everybody with no exceptions. And I think I read a lot of pregnancy loss policies and the work that I do as well. And actually, for me, less is more. I know that sounds a bit silly, but people try and put in, if you experience this loss and this loss and this loss, and invariably what you do is you miss one out. So we've had one recently where termination for medical reasons was excluded, and actually that's a loss. So, you know, and then the people that would potentially be affected by that wouldn't feel included. So keep it simple. The flexibility is absolutely right, as Holly said, and it's not a one-off event. It's not a policy you pick up and you go, I've got this policy, it'll help you today. The end, I've done
Yeah.
my bit. Again, we're reverting back to the tick box. And it's also really important to be led by the individual. So a policy's good if it's guidance and it's not literally black and white with no flexibility in it, because you can't, it's like square peg round hole. That's how I
Yeah.
describe it. You can't, everyone's experience is going to be different. Everyone's trauma is going to be processed differently. Everyone will deal with things. Somebody might go, I'll come back to work, I'll be fine. And then a year down the line, or when the due date's there may be some kind of psychological problems. So you can't just say if this happens and if this happens, but I think it's again the indication of psychological safety. Signposting employees to any employee assistance program or any kind of psychological support, or even outside of work, you know, and just saying, look, we hear you, you might need this help and this is where it is. So somebody's not reliant on knowing everything. I want to say something here, if that's okay, Celine. The other thing that I'm really keen to stress is that I work with a lot of line managers. This is not about line managers having something else to deal with, right? This is about being empathetic and leading with that power, because, you know, whether it's bereavement, whether it's suicide, whether it's any key kind of topic in the workplace, you don't need to emotionally deal with it differently. It's just having those centered and those grounded traits that you can listen to somebody, not tell them what to do, be there for them, be led by them, and actually, you know, just be supportive if and when they need it.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's so important. And I think what you say about flexibility is really key. And sometimes a lot of kind of teams come to us and say, where is the line between being vague and being flexible, right? And so that's quite difficult. So it's very important to be very clear and to have that clarity to say to the individual, you know, what is on offer and what is not, where they can find the information. Will it be
Yes.
paid or unpaid? Can they,
Yeah.
you know, how do they book it in their HR system? I know these sounds like very detailed things, but when you're going through this vulnerable time, you don't have to want to figure out and navigate all these things at all. So absolutely agree with everything that you're saying. It's so important. So we touched a bit on, I guess you were talking, Holly, about baby showers, etc. I think what we were implying is employee resource groups can be important. Sometimes fertility champions. I mean, they don't need to be called specifically in those ways, but having people who are advocating on behalf of other people. It could be one specific person. It could be a body that has designated themselves, because you don't really know who the employee will be most comfortable with. And again, it's having the employee lead that conversation, really. And I wanted to kind of close that with the resources area. As you said, Claire, there are so many resources, whether it's Tommy's or the Miscarriage Association, and it's really key to include that in the policy. I will share a template of our policy, because I did have someone ask in the chat, and this is not necessarily, you know, it's not the Fertifa policy, it's a template that you can tailor to your organization, and every organization is going to be different. And as Claire said, it also should be like a living, breathing document that kind of grows with you, and not a policy that you just put somewhere and then never look at again. So I will share that in a minute, and feel free to download it. And I'm sure, Claire, you have you've said you've looked at lots and lots of templates. So you know, if we can definitely follow up when we do the recording with any more
Yeah.
resources that you find very helpful as
Okay.
well. I think that'd be great. All right, so let's go to the actual manager training. I'm going to kind of stay with you, Claire, for a little bit, and the work that you do at Fertility Matters at Work. How would someone approach training with managers? You know, what are some of the things that are important to consider when wanting to begin such a training?
Okay, so you said at the beginning of this call about sensitivity and all that sort of stuff. So it's really important that the people you're training are mindful of their own kind of journeys as well. So, you know, we don't want people to be in a situation where they feel they have to help someone else when they're going through their own lived experience of maybe pregnancy loss. So I think again, this needs to be very fluid and very kind of flexible in how you do it. And I really don't think sitting in front of a load of people and telling them what to do is the way to go. I think this is all around kind of a conversational bit where you just say, right, I'm going to talk about pregnancy loss, what it means to people. Has anyone got any lived experience they'd like to share? I'd be happy to share, or experience of when they've dealt with it as a line manager in the past. And it's about knowledge sharing and understanding what went well, what didn't go well, what are the key generic things you can do, like I've already talked about. So it's about listening, empathizing, not fixing it for somebody, you know, all the stuff that you would do in a day-to-day conversation, and actually just be there for the people. Yeah, just I don't want managers again to think, oh God, something else I have to learn about. We don't need managers to know what a molar pregnancy is. We don't need them to know all that stuff. Is it's important, but it's not absolutely essential for them to lead with that empathy head that I keep reiterating. It's really important that people just go, right, I get that this is something that might be upsetting for my employees. This is what I can do. These are my kind of realms of responsibility. And you know, as a manager myself, usually I have conversations with my team if they're going through things. I'm like, what will help you right now? What will make a difference to what's going on right now? And sometimes that saying things like just take what you need isn't helpful, because someone's like, what is that? Is
I
that a
don't know
month?
what I
Is it
need. Yeah.
6 months? Is it 10 years? I don't know. So, you know, having that conversation and having that relationship where you can just say, look, at the minute, I think I need a week or so to kind of get my head together, and I'll feel a little bit better, then I'll have a conversation with you. But, you know, that comes with experience as well as, you know, knowledge. And sadly, sometimes you have to go through a bad experience to come out the other side and do it better, because that's how humans learn.
Yes, 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 for sure. And you know, we always say on our webinars, you need to get it wrong to get it right. And you know, that you need to
Absolutely.
start somewhere. And you know, everybody knows that everyone's trying. There's no really bad
Yeah.
intentions. But if you can practice and if you can learn and better yourself, then you know, that's really positive. So still on the manager training topic, Holly, I know that, you know, we work obviously with a lot of teams of our clients. You know, what are some of the considerations that are important when thinking of training managers in the workplace?
I think that we've talked about already, we're not expecting line managers to be sort of like the font of all knowledge when it comes to this. You know, they are just a support resource. I have found that with this type of topic in particular, that those training sessions being optional can often lead to better outcomes. And I know that sounds a bit counterintuitive when you're trying to get a workplace that is supportive of pregnancy loss. But what you find is that with an optional session, that you tend to get those that really want to be there and really want to make a difference. And that can be the start of quite a big culture shift within a company. You know, you have a couple of, you know, champions, so to speak, that are kind of talking about it more, encouraging people to speak up, or, you know, are at least a known resource within a company that someone can go to and sort of talk about their experiences. So, and yeah, it sounds counterintuitive, but actually is much more productive, I think, in the outcomes from that session. You know, I think it's important that you, as I said, don't feel like you need to have all the answers. I don't think you need to have all the details, much like we've touched on already. It's just checking in. It's just being led by your employees as to what they want and what they need. Again, I think we've had examples where a line manager has called up while someone was in hospital, sort of asking about workload, for example. You know, I know it's well intentioned so that you want to kind of cover that workload, but actually that's not what that person needs in the time. And actually, is that phone call necessary? Are there other mechanisms within the company that you can sort of use to find out that information? But it's all about the softer skills. It's not about the cold hard facts about these things. And I think that is the most important thing when considering these types of trainings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the Miscarriage Association website because it really just said what you said, Claire, about listening and also just saying, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Because sometimes that's all that is needed to show that you're there and that you're listening. And in your experience, kind of working with people who come to you or companies, I know it can be very difficult sometimes for employees to actually disclose what's going on. So is there anything that managers can do to make people more comfortable to disclose that fact, or what's
Oh,
your
that's it. I think there's a whole book you could write on that. I guess for me, this again, it's about the relationship and it's about leading. Treat people how you like to be treated. That's basically the strap line that I'm going to use. And if you're going through something really difficult, what would work for you? What behaviours would work? What a manager says and does, and when they do it, what's going to help you in that? I think. Sorry, Celine, somebody put, I think it was Ella put something about if you can't go to your line manager. We often find that. We find that with a lot of conversations that the line manager can be a blocker as well as an enabler to these conversations happening. And a lot of organizations that we work with do put in alternative pathways for people. So Holly, you talked about advocates. So we talk about advocates a lot. So if you don't feel safe going to your line manager, but there is somebody else in the organization you can go to and it's handled correctly, then that's absolutely fine. But again, the organization needs to give that a nod and say it's all right, and then they need to educate the line managers that it's not going behind your back and it's not doing this, it's just because they don't feel safe. But then there's a bigger question for me: why don't you feel safe with your line manager? That's something else that kind of plays into work politics. So
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important question. I mean, from my experience, it's great if that person is comfortable going to HR, because that means they're going to somebody. I have had experience where people go to a peer, they don't go to HR, they don't go to a manager. And I guess that's good as well, but that person might not know how to support from a practical sense. So it is
yes.
always good to try and disclose as much as the person is comfortable, just to get the best support and the best care and the right information as well. So, but that's a really, really good question. And it happens all the time, doesn't it? Which is why, we're trying to create better spaces, more psychological safety. And again, this can be a whole webinar, but there is so many things not to say and what you can say. But when you work with people, Claire, are there, and I know I alluded to saying just, I'm sorry, was there anything else that you wanted to add in how to best respond to someone who is coming to you and saying, I'm going through a pregnancy loss, or I have gone through a pregnancy loss?
We have a list, and they're all like real life examples. So things like it was early. We get people, I know Holly will probably nod to this as well. At least it was early. Anything that starts with at least or just,
Oh,
it was just meant to
I was
be,
about
or
to
you
say
can
with that.
try
Never
it.
start
Yeah,
with
Holly,
at least.
yeah, I've heard them
it
all. I've heard
wasn't
them
meant
all,
to
and
be. That is also.
cringe. It's not, again, it's not for you to kind of make that judgment on people. It's, and again, people think they're coming at it, I like to believe, from a real compassionate place, but it's just the wrong thing to say.
Yeah.
It'd be quite
Or
harmful.
I've also heard, oh, but you already have one child, so it's all right.
It's meant to be, that meant to be one just really kills me. I'm just like, how can you don't say that. There's a really good cartoon somewhere I've seen, and it says if we dealt with loss of a sibling like we do with pregnancy loss, and it's like, it was all right, you can, it was this, they had a good life, blah blah blah, and all that language just transfers. It is okay, people perceive it to be okay if it's with pregnancy loss, but it's not okay for other losses. And I think we need to kind of level the playing field here and just recognize, which is what I talked about with that Jerry McCluskey quote about a hidden loss and a disenfranchised loss. It's still a loss.
Yeah.
And it still needs to be validated, to be grieved, because she talks about that, because otherwise you can kind of get into some quite complex emotional journeys with that.
Absolutely. So on that point on training managers, was there anything else, Claire, from Fertility Matters at Work perspective? I mean, we talked about a lot of things, obviously, just general training, making people comfortable, creating psychological safety, really being mindful of things you can say or not. We talked about a bit about managing triggers as well, in the workplace. Anything else to add?
The best way to deal with any of these sensitive topics is to gauge lived experience, because that is so powerful. So we at Fertility Matters at Work, we use storytelling as a kind of real starting point for the conversation, because once the conversation's understood and you have that real life experience from your own employees, you start understanding how you can piece those things together and make something really happen that will make a difference to people. So yeah, for me, it's that initial conversation. I know it sounds really basic and straightforward, but that's how we learn. We learn from people who've experienced things, and we get to increase our knowledge bucket and understand what would make a difference to people. And that's how you then evolve your policy, right? You don't have your standalone policy that just stays there and every 3 years you go and go, I'll update it. It should be fluid and it should evolve, because legislation might change, or there might be more instances of pregnancy loss, or something else might happen. Things are changing all the time. So for me, it's definitely start at the bottom. And I don't mean at the bottom as in bottom layers of people, but the bottom with your employees. Give them a voice so they can then shape a future policy for your organization.
Absolutely. On that point, actually, I'm going to go to you, Holly. It's also very important to have leadership buy-in, right? Because sometimes you can have the best policy in the world, or whether it's about pregnancy loss or anything else. But if there is not kind of the leadership, I guess, partnership and collaboration to let employee actually use those policies and live through those policies, then people won't really use it. So any thoughts, Holly, on creating that psychological safety, I guess, from the top?
I think it just starts with trying to have sort of open and compassionate conversations. And those conversations don't have to be around pregnancy loss. If an employee knows that they can go to you for a doctor's appointment that's completely unrelated and they get a good response at that point, then they're more likely to come to someone with something a bit more sensitive, like pregnancy loss. I don't think we need to kind of like treat it completely in a silo. Like, it's all about that support from line managers and whatever that conversation may be. I do think that it is helpful to have support elsewhere within the company as well. And I think if you kind of like work towards changing that shift in culture, then people do just tend to generally feel a bit more comfortable talking about things. Whether that's employee resource groups that are kind of talking about the policy and what that policy should look like and what support people are going to want, or whether that's sort of using external support, whether that's for someone like Fertility Matters at Work, for example, that kind of takes the lead on that, or for TIFA even, there's all sorts of different support out there, even if you need a support kind of implementing that to begin with. But it's all starting with that sort of culture shift and sort of making it less of a taboo within that workplace.
Absolutely. Claire, did you want to add anything?
No, I just agree with what Holly says. I mean, we work with a lot of people, and these conversations can be so powerful. We worked with one of our clients recently, said that the impact on their organization from raising the conversation around fertility was phenomenal. And that just says it. I love that quote, because I'm just like, that it's amazing what you can do, because well-being, people are like, oh, well-being, well, it's doing this, that, and other, it's dressed down Friday or whatever, all these kinds of really silly things that don't make any impact at all. But this is the real stuff, the stuff that happens in life that people need support with, because we talk a lot about bringing your whole self to work, and you can't leave yourself at the front door. But more often than not, we're expected to put our game face on, and we're expected to kind of just, everything's fine, and it isn't. You can't work like that. It's quite debilitating. I think you don't get the best out of people.
Absolutely. And I think our medical director, Gideon Lieberman, says this all the time. If and I speak from my own experience, when you're going through something like that, it occupies a lot of your brain space. You're going to
Of
be
course it does.
online, you're going to be, looking for answers, you're going to go on
Yeah.
forums, you're not going to be sleeping. And so the more clarity, the more support that you can give someone, then again, the more productive they'll be, and, the more they can, come back to work, essentially. And that's what they want. That's what they want. They want to come back to work, and they want to be happy and productive. And so it is very, very important to think about those things. Right, we are almost at 10 to 1. So what I'm going to do now is just share the policy template that Fertifa has. And again, there's lots of great templates out there, so don't feel like you have to use that, but it's just a starting point. If you're not sure where to start, let me know if the link doesn't work for any reason. And we will open it up to the Q&A. give you a few minutes to type questions. You can use the Q&A anonymous chat box, or you can chat in the chat as everyone has been doing, which is great. We actually have one question, so I'm going to start with that. How can we support a manager who has experienced a miscarriage or pregnancy loss themselves and would find speaking about it with a member of their team triggering?
I'd nominate somebody else. That's quite simple for me, because you need to protect your own self as well. You can't, you know your limitations, and there are things that trigger people. And actually, we need to be equally as supportive of line managers as we are employees. So that for me is just have those advocates that both Holly and I have talked about, or those resource groups, or the ERGs that you create in your own organisation, and do it that way. I've never ever forced somebody to have a conversation with someone if they weren't comfortable in that space. That's bad leadership as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's very important to protect that person as much as it is to protect the person coming. And I don't think the employee who is going through that would find anything negative about that. In fact, they would just respect, because they would feel that, oh, that person is taking into consideration, which means that they're going to take me into consideration as well. So absolutely. Holly, did you want to add anything, or is that what you were going to say as well?
I was I was sort of looking at it from a slightly different perspective, in that it might be that line manager doesn't want to identify themselves as someone that might find that conversation triggering as well. And I think that's where, again, similar to what Claire said, I think this, as much as the sort of what the entitlement is in your pregnancy loss policy, whatever that may be, is not a one size fits all. The way that support is structured is not also going to be applicable to everyone as well. I think making something like this mandatory for all line managers is really tricky. So again, having the champions, the advocates, the employee resource group is all helpful, and kind of doesn't sort of pinpoint anybody in particular that may or may not want to disclose that either. I mean, hopefully one day we don't feel like we have to hide these things, and everyone does feel comfortable sharing it. But I'm very aware that is not the case in many cases. So
I think that's okay, because I think it's a personal choice, right? I think, whether people want to share or whether people don't want to share, I think creating the space for having the option, if they do, is what's important. Because, thinking back to my first miscarriage, I don't see a situation where I would have wanted to share it, even if, and I had all the support in the world. So, yeah, no, that just made me think about that. We're getting quite a few questions now, so I'm gonna try and answer them. So next question, we cover pregnancy loss in our bereavement and compassionate leave policy. Do you recommend it as a standalone policy? Claire, what's your view?
Either or, as long as it's really clear to people. You don't have to have a dedicated pregnancy loss policy. Some organisations do, some organisations don't. The only place I wouldn't put it is in your maternity one. That's a big no-no from me.
Absolutely. Because there's completely different mindsets and situations when you're
It's not appropriate.
Yeah, it's not appropriate. So absolutely, as long as it's somewhere, it's very important. And again, make sure it's clear, make sure people know where to find it. I think that's important as well.
Don't bury it. Don't bury it
Exactly.
in something.
Absolutely. I mean, with my HR hat on, sometimes, when we're doing onboarding, give all the information, and then it is important to remind people of where things are. And also, people absorb information in a very different way. So somebody might find it very useful to hear someone talking about it. Somebody would like to watch a video or read a policy. And so have those options available to people to be able to get there. Right. So, you suggested having advocates, which I think is great. How would you deal with managers that do not show the sympathy or compassion to individuals going through pregnancy loss? Claire?
With my professional head on, I will answer that. I have another opinion. Do you know what? You cannot make people be compassionate. You can't, but you can make them be respectful in the organization. Most organizations will have values or mission statements that refer to how you interact with your colleagues, and if you can't be either of those things, then you actually shouldn't be line managing people, is my actual opinion. And you can't make people be compassionate. But if the manager is kind of, it's not a conversation for me, I think that's really good that they feel safe to say, this isn't something I feel I can deal with. And that's when you have those alternative advocates and alternative signposting and resources and stuff like that, because otherwise, like I said at the beginning, that person might be like, whoa, this is just too much. And some people find it really awkward for
Yeah.
all sorts of reasons. You know, it's not fair to place that pressure unnecessarily on somebody if they don't feel comfortable with it. But there is that fine line. You can be respectful and say no, or you can be disrespectful and say no.
Absolutely. There's another interesting question, and I'll go to you, Holly, for this one. I mean, it's quite a long question, but I think the essence of the question is about abusing policies and in terms of, evidence provided, right? So how do you build something into your policy on pregnancy loss to try and manage abuse of that policy? Obviously, you don't want to be suspicious or come at it from a negative stance, but sometimes it can affect the ability to grow progressive, supportive policies. You don't want to be asking again of evidence and proof, but what is the line, I guess, in that situation?
It's a really good question and a tricky question. First off, I think in many cases there might not actually be a written proof of what's gone on. For some people, it will just be that they've done a pregnancy test at home and have some bleeding at some point later. We don't always get like a doctor sign off on like confirming a pregnancy loss, for example. So that's not always something you would be able to get anyway, and I don't necessarily support that notion, to being completely frank. It is tricky, and I think it's all down to sort of like building that trust and within the support within that workplace. And I know there will always be sort of exceptions to that, but I think it's important. It's helpful to sort of educate on the different scenarios that might occur around different pregnancy losses, and the sort of like the understanding of what might be expected, whether that's sort of like the number of medical appointments that might be involved in a standard ectopic pregnancy. And again, I don't mean to just sort of belittle that sort of scenario by saying standard, but it just sort of helps you then be able to identify what's likely to come up for that person, if you have the information. But it's definitely tricky, but hopefully that relationship is there between the employee and the line manager to sort of not have that be the case.
Claire,
Can I add something, please, Celine? Is that okay? There's also, I think, how would you know it's being abused? Because I have friends that have had multiple losses over a very short period of time. So, someone on the outside might be going, "Oh, they're making it up because they've had 5 in 6 months." That is it's viable, and actually, you are causing probably more psychological damage by asking. I definitely with you, Holly. I wouldn't ask for proof of that. And I think it would be a very, very minute percentage of people, if they were going to do it, they would do it. But it's just then it's going to take it away from all the genuine people as well. So it's that fine balance, isn't it? And it is that safety bit.
Yeah,
About
I
feeling
think
safe.
safety and, trusting that the person is coming to you with, because it is very hard to come forward when you are going through that. So you're right. But it's a very good question, of course. Right. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to ask Claire and Holly for one takeaway from the session. And I just love how, we've done so many webinars, Holly and I, now on this topic, and still, every time I personally learn something new. So as we said, we can always continue to learn, have an open mind, and don't, be afraid to get it wrong, to get it right. So Claire, going to you, what is one takeaway that someone can take from today's session?
My big one is this is not a women's health issue. That's my big one, because we hear so much about people being left out of these conversations. That's a big one for me, especially in organizations.
Love it. Holly?
For me, I think it's that managers do not need to have all the answers. It is just about compassion, being able to listen, checking in when it's appropriate, and just sort of helping contribute towards that culture shift within the workplace if you don't already have that.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Holly. Thank you, Claire, for this insightful session.
Thank you.
Everyone to joining and giving us your time. We hope you found that valuable, and we'll be following up with a recording soon. And have a lovely rest of your day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.